Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I am Matthew Silverman, the Executive Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our program this evening with Dr. Bernice Lerner. Her lecture this evening is in part our way of honoring International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This evening will provide us the opportunity to reflect upon the horrors of the Holocaust, the suffering of the victims, the strife of the liberators, and the fortitude of those who had to build new lives. In the world today, it is essential for us to continue to listen to and retell these stories so that we can build a better world for future generations. I would also like to extend a special thank you to the Jewish residents of Leisure World for helping bring this lecture to our community today. And with that brief welcome, I would now like to introduce Art Hessel, the Haberman Institute Board Vice President, to introduce our speaker. Hi, Art.
Hi, Matt, and thank you very much. Everybody, welcome. We're so happy that you're with us today, those of you who live here in the Washington area and those of you who live far away from the many states of this union, Canada, and even further. We're happy to have you all here today. As you probably know, today is January 27th, 2022. And 77 years ago today, on January 27th, 1945, Russian troops entered the Auschwitz concentration camp, liberating the prisoners who remained there and at nearby Birkenau. Shocked by what they found, as were the Allied troops as they entered other Nazi concentration camps during the months that followed. On November 1, 2005, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution designating January 27th of each year as International Day of Commemoration of the Victims of the Holocaust, or as it's more often known, Holocaust Remembrance Day. The theme of this year's commemoration is memory, dignity, and justice. The Bergen-Belsen work camp in the heart of Germany was liberated in April 1945. And that is what our program today concerns itself with, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And we're honored to have Dr. Bernice Lerner with us tonight to speak on that subject and her recent book titled All the Horrors of War, a Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. I'm the vice president of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, a 40-year-old organization founded by the late Rabbi Joshua Haberman. Our mission is to create a broad, lifelong learning community through the provision of in-depth encounters with Jewish thought and history and culture. You can learn more about us by visiting our website, www.habermaninstitute.org. In February, you can join us for lecture programs on Who Wrote the Bible, A Texas Perspective on Jewish History. Those are different programs. Did the Exodus Really Happen? And Southern Jews and Black Civil Rights. And we're also starting 3 new courses in February that you might be interested in. We hope you are. Now, back to tonight. Bernice Lerner is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Born in New York, she graduated from the State University of New York at Stony Brook with a BA summa cum laude. She received a master's degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a PhD from Boston University. She's been an elementary school teacher, the director of continuing education at Hebrew College in Boston, and is currently a senior scholar and formerly the director of Boston University's Center for the Advancement of Character and Social Responsibility. This is her second book. She's a prominent lecturer in a number of areas, including the Holocaust. After her presentation, we will have time for some questions and responses. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab, the Q&A tab on your screen. We won't have live back and forth, but your questions will be read and will be filtered, and Dr. Lerner will have an opportunity to respond to as many of them as we have time for. With that, Dr. Lerner, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Art, and thank you, Matt, and thank you to the Haberman Institute and to Leisure World and to all of you who've chosen to participate in this webinar tonight. I'm going to now share my screen and share my presentation with you. So I'm going to make this connection between today, January 27th, the day that marks the liberation of Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the subject I'm going to be talking about. And I kind of wish I had been able to be like a fly on the wall at the UN General Assembly when they decided in 2005 to choose January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's really curious to me, and in some ways it's quite logical. Of the death camps, there were probably more people at Auschwitz at the end of the war. These are the camps where there were gas chambers and crematoria. I mean, Chelm, Sobibor, Treblinka had all been dismantled in 1943 for various reasons. There was Belzec, there was nobody there anymore. Majdanek was liberated in July of 1944. So the biggest of the death camps was Auschwitz, and you can see kind of why they show it. And I'm going to show you some images during this presentation, and I'm a little bit trembling, particularly when we get to the ones about Bergen-Belsen. But yeah, these were individuals, these were people this happened to. Everyone had a life, a family, and we have to honor their memories. But I'm showing you them not to violate their privacy, but really just to give you a picture and a little bit of an education. And these photographs from Auschwitz are very rare. They're part of the Auschwitz album. There's only two very different types of albums that were uncovered after the war, where in this case, an SS officer had taken some photographs of what was going on in the camp. And you can imagine what might have been going through his mind as he's trying to pick things. But here you can see the men in the striped pajama type uniforms are from the, they were Jews who were helping people get off the trains and escorting them, and in some cases displaying resistance by whispering to a young mother with a child, give your child to the grandmother, because, you know, and because people here, these are photographs from a Hungarian transport that arrived in May, second or third week of May 1945, when the killing was at its peak in Auschwitz. And so you could just sort of see what is going on. And these people had absolutely no idea where they had arrived. My parents, my grandparents were part of the Hungarian deportation to Auschwitz. It was the largest modern industrialized killing in the history of the world. It was unprecedented, and all that had come before it had built up to it, right? By this point, the gas chambers and the killing process and the ovens had been perfected, and new installations were brought into Auschwitz-Birkenau in preparation for the killing of more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews, the last unmolested group of Jews left in Europe. And yeah, it was, and these people had no idea where they would be taken, and they were all taken to Birkenau. So you can get a sense of the sail lapel, the lining up for being counted, and the women being given these gray sack dresses. And here on the bottom, this is striking, and I'm showing it to you because I think there could be more written about this, and people don't always think about it, but the plunder, the things that people brought in with them to the camps, the things that were stolen from Jews from their homes, non-Jews going into the homes and ransacking them as soon as the Jews were taken away. The things, for example, that the Hungarian government would not allow to leave Hungary, to the point of clipping off gold earrings from little girls' ears, and just what was taken away from the Jews. And here they brought some of their valuables to Auschwitz-Birkenau, right? They didn't know where they were being taken. And they were the voluminous amount of materials that were brought in, the suitcases and every kind of material thing that you can imagine, and photographs and eyeglasses and money of all currencies of all types. They were all sorted in this place called Canada. It was named Canada because Canada is a very big, vast country. And the Jews who were lucky, a small group, were siphoned off and selected to work in Canada. And in my book, I tell a story of my mom having an encounter with somebody from Canada. And so this is the sorting of the goods. So, but what happened was on January 27th, when the Russians came in, there was actually an order given by Himmler the summer before, that the Germans knew they were losing the war, and that no inmate was to be turned over alive to any Allied force. So knowing the Russians were so near, about 11 or 12 days before the Russians actually entered Auschwitz, the Jews who remained, who were still able to walk, were put on this death march, what became known as the death marches. So when the Russians arrived in Auschwitz, there were only people who were sick or maybe children who could not walk left in the camp. So you had about 58 to 60,000 people evacuated, like around January 11th or 12th. And when the Russians came in on January 27th, there was fewer than 8,000 people in the camp. And Auschwitz was actually a big complex. And Auschwitz I was the main camp that was built at first, where there was a lot of Polish prisoners of war and Russian prisoners of war. And 2 miles away, roughly 2 miles away, was Birkenau, where most of the Jews were taken to be killed. There was one gas chamber and crematoria here, and there was 4 here, and they were really about 1,000 Sonderkommando Jewish prisoners were working and ushering people into the gas chambers and taking and processing them, and then taking them to where the ovens were, and everything, for the whole killing machinery, from having to smash the remaining bones and the ashes and dump them into the marshes over here. And about 4 miles away from the main Auschwitz I complex was Auschwitz II, Buna, where they had this synthetic rubber or oil plant, and they used a lot of Jewish slave labor. So these were the numbers of people that remained in Auschwitz at the time of the liberation. So it was not what it might have been, because most of the inmates had been put on death marches. So really, what happened on the death marches? So there was a panic. There was this order from Himmler over the summer, but without a lot of instruction, right? The SS and the various camps did not have many details, only that no Jew should be turned over alive. And as they were being marched out of Auschwitz, either sort of northwest or directly north, they were taken to these various camps. And these camps were also being evacuated. And you had something like maybe over 700,000 Jews still alive in these concentration camps, mostly working for the German war effort as slave laborers in January of 1945. And as they're going on the death march, there are no really precise numbers, but something like 250,000 were killed or died on these marches. It was a bitter cold winter. The January of 1945 was colder, like one of the coldest winters on record, and people did not have adequate clothing or footwear, certainly not enough food, barely any food. Maybe they were given a little extra ration when they started out on these marches, and they were weak and they were dying, and if they couldn't go on, they were shot, and some very few managed to escape, but it was near impossible. And it was really a big chapter in the history of the Holocaust were the death marches. So they were deposited deep, deep inside Germany. A lot of people were deposited in Flossenburg and Buchenwald and Dachau. And one of the furthermost places was Bergen-Belsen. So here you had people who were brought into Bergen-Belsen camp, and the camp wasn't, obviously it wasn't like it turned out to be in this winter and spring of 1945, a year earlier. In fact, it's really hard to say anything about the camps because everything was sort of an evolution that correlated with the winds of war and what was happening in the war. But here you had in Bergen-Belsen an untenable situation because you didn't have adequate housing for people. You didn't have any kind of sanitary facilities or medical facilities, not enough food. And all these people who had been strong enough, who had evaded the gas chambers in Auschwitz, right? Most of these people were in their 20s and 30s. They worked as slave laborers in various camps, and they were being marched, and they endured the death marches under very terrible conditions, and then they were dumped in Bergen-Belsen. So by the time we get to sort of the main part of my book and what I'm going to be talking to you about in Bergen-Belsen, by the time the British army finally reached Bergen-Belsen, there were 60,000 people there. It was the largest number of people were here. In Dachau, there was maybe that amount, including all of Dachau's subcamps. Maybe there were 20,000 Jews in Dachau at the end, but Bergen-Belsen had the largest number, and nobody could cope with it. So it's kind of a horrific story and extraordinary in certain ways. So that is really, that is the story I tell in my book, All the Horrors of War. And the way I tell it is I focus on two protagonists. I focus on my mom, who was a child survivor. She was only 15 at the war's end, and she really was one of the people who was barely made it. The norm was death, and and that's what happened to Anne Frank, right? She arrived in Bergen-Belsen just a week or two after Anne Frank died there. And Anne Frank was a little bit older than her. And the Brigadier Glen Hughes, who was at the time of the liberation, the Deputy Director of Medical Services for the entire British Second Army. He was a very high ranking officer. And I just wanted to show you the cover of my book in the US and the cover in the UK, because the UK had the same images and everything to work with, and they came up with a completely different concept. So, but here you see my mother standing, and this is about 7 months after the liberation. It's one of the earliest pictures we have of her. And she's in Arvika in Northwest Sweden, snowy, and in this tuberculosis sanitarium. And you can see that she's not like happy, right? She's very, very sick. She's deathly sick, even though the black and blue marks had faded, and she has some nutrition. Still, she's ailing from this terrible disease, and she's orphaned, and only she and her older sister survived. They lost their parents and 4 younger siblings, and aunts, uncles, and cousins, and her grandmother, and her friends, and her community, and everything. And she had just barely made it. And here is Glen Hughes. And this, you can see he's kind of startled in this photograph. It was taken in his caravan, which was on the near Bergen-Belsen. And here he was working on maybe he was even arranging for the 5 levels of diets that you feed to emaciated people, depending what stage of starvation they were in. And he is trying to get help from wherever he can, because it was quite a shock entering Bergen-Belsen. It was not what he expected. So how was I going to tell the story of these two very different people, right? A liberator and there's the victim. And it was quite a challenge to figure out. I rewrote the book a couple of times. And finally, I settled on, with my editor from Johns Hopkins University Press, we settled on telling this whole story, the entire story, over 1 year. And in fact, it was a race against time rescue story, because the Hungarian deportation was in the spring of 1944. And that is roughly around the time, in summertime, Glen Hughes and the troops landed on Normandy. It was D-Day. So it was really, that year was a very dramatic year. So the meat of the book is the 4 seasons, really what happens as these two people, if one from the east of Europe, one's from the west, and as the winds of war are blowing them toward this hell in northwest Germany. And the 5th season is the convergence in Bergen-Belsen, what from the liberation from 2 very different perspectives. Excuse me. So the book is, so I sandwiched the meat of the book between the Belsen trial, which was really significant. I give like a few paragraphs about it in the beginning and the end, because people don't really know about the Belsen trial. Everybody has heard of the Nuremberg trials, but the Belsen trial was the first war crimes trial to apply international law to these crimes committed by the Nazis. And it was very significant for a number of reasons, but one is that Glen Hughes was the first witness at the Belsen trial, and he set the tone for the case. Now, there are 45 SS officers who are defendants. There were more than 480 SS who worked at the camp, Nazi officers, the vast majority of whom ran away as part of a truce between the British and the German armies. 80 remained at the camp for the handover, but only 45 were on trial. And I highlight this one because I talk a little bit about her, Irma Gracie, because she's 22 years old when she's hung at the end of the war, and she was beautiful. She was very strikingly beautiful, and this really sadistic beast. So she was sort of a standout for the journalists covering the trial. And this is an Army Talks magazine from November 11th, 1945, and it shows the trial it was in a makeshift courtroom in Lüneburg, Germany, which Lüneburg is its own history, Nazi history. And then I sandwich the book between a prologue and an epilogue, where I get to really tell some really important parts of my mom's story and Glen Hughes' story pre and post war, or from the beginning of the war. And then in the end, which is really kind of significant, because I talk about really what happens to this orphan. I kind of tried in writing this I left myself completely out of the book, for better or worse. I just really focused on my mom, and I kind of tried to separate myself from her. Like, if you can sort of envision your parents before you came into the picture, like what were they like as children, as adolescents? What were their biological endowments? What was their temperament like? What circumstances did they have to navigate in their life? I kind of tried to look at her as this kid, and she was as I separated myself from her, she wasn't my mother, as if she wasn't, I could look at her and think, wow, this is a pretty compelling character, because in a way she was sort of like very different from an Anne Frank, right? She was never going to keep a diary like Anne Frank, but she was very quantitatively oriented and business oriented, and she had a very hard Scrabble childhood. She was helping her grandmother with her grandmother's butcher business. She had to help out a lot at home, had a lot of responsibility, had to miss a lot of schooling, and she was kind of interesting. So rather than a diary, she came to Auschwitz with the black book with all of their customers' orders and how much they owed to Auschwitz. And Glen Hughes was a very compelling character, because I thought when I started to look into his story and precisely how my mother's life was saved, which is really how I came to Glen Hughes, because my mom and I, who had this sort of organic exchange my whole life, could not tell me how she was rescued because she had fallen unconscious at the end of the war. And I wanted to figure out precisely how was it that she got from this dung infested hut to this makeshift hospital room. And Glen Hughes features really large in the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and he was a very compassionate rescuer, and like an Oscar Schindler type of character, he maintained relationships with survivors for the rest of his life. He was a real champion for the Zionist cause, and he visited Israel many times and became a champion of the Jewish people. So I thought people should know about him. So anyway, here's the map. And I'm going to here's Bergen-Belsen in Northwest Germany. And I'm just going to show you, for the purposes of this presentation, I'll tell you a bit about the starting points where Glen Hughes was, and the Yorkshire Wolds, where the British Army was practicing, and where my mom started out in Sziget, which was part of Transylvania or Hungary at the time of the war. And then I'm going to tell you just a fact or two about Auschwitz and D-Day. And then I'm going to really hone in on Bergen-Belsen. So the Yorkshire Wolds, where Glen Hughes started out, he didn't start out with as high ranking. He got promoted during the war, but here at this point he was director of medical services for the British Army's 8th Corps, which would go on to see the fighting against the most vicious panzer troops. They saw some of the hardest fighting coming into Europe and going up through France and Belgium and Holland, and breaching the fortress of Germany. But they were starting out in the Yorkshire Wolds to practice, and Glen Hughes was a stickler for preparedness, for how long does it take to assemble a casualty clearing station and a regimental aid post. And they practiced here because it resembled the Normandy coast, right? The Yorkshire Wolds supposedly look like the Normandy coast, except the Allies were not really prepared for all the hedgerows they would encounter and how difficult the fighting would be there. And then my mom started out in Sziget. So a great sadness for me and for my family is that we don't have a single photograph of my mom or I don't know what my grandparents look like. We don't have any photographs of her from before the war at all. So all she could do one day, I asked her about it, and she got inspired to somehow do this. And she actually drew a map of her street where she lived in Sziget. And she lived between Timar Utsa and Kigya Utsa, which was Snake Street. And Kigya Utsa is where the Jews in Sziget were made to sit on the streets. They were evacuated from Sziget. I think it was on four different days, 3,000 people at a time. And here was her apartment, and they had to walk through just to the other end through someone's backyard to go to Kigya Utsa before they were marched to the synagogues, and the whole story of their deportation. And Elie Wiesel's house was about over here. So that was kind of interesting. And I was on a trip to Sziget just before the pandemic. And Alicia Wiesel was on this trip. It was for descendants of Szigeti survivors. And he said that he had come earlier on a trip with his father, and Elie Wiesel had told him he was like seeing ghosts as he was walking around the town, because it's really nothing like it was when they were growing up there. And he said there are two Szigets. There's one as it exists today, and there's Sziget Min HaShamayim, and from the heavens. And it was and that's how I'm kind of glad my mother didn't come on this trip with me, because I'd rather her have those memories of Sziget in the heavens. It was a beautiful town. Here's an old postcard of it. It's surrounded by the Carpathian Mountains and bordered by the Tisa and Isa rivers. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful town. Some of the old buildings are still there, but it was very vibrant Jewishly, very spiritual. Elie Wiesel once said that you couldn't go, and there nowhere does it exist. Like you could go to Mea Sharim in Jerusalem and it doesn't come close to what Siget was in the years that he was growing up there. It was 12,000 Jews. They were about 40% of the population, and it was a vibrant community. And this was like an alley. My mother's address was 32 Timar Utza. And Timar Utza was over here about where that house is in the background. And this is about the distance. Nothing exists there now. And this is just a map. My mom, when she was born, it was Romania. This was a land of changing borders, crazy making changing borders. And the Hungarians came in 1940, and everything changed since then. Here's Siget, and Hitler awarded them Northern Transylvania. And that's a big story. So now jumping to June 6th as a marker on the timeline. So on June 6th, D-Day, you had arriving on the coast of Normandy this amazing military invasion, nothing like it, completely duped the Germans, which was unbelievable. 150,000 Allied troops, from the United States, Great Britain, and Canada, invaded the Normandy coast, and on 7,000 boats. And just one really important statistic is that on this day, 4,414 Allied troops were killed. More than double the number of Jews were killed in Auschwitz on that single day. More than double the number. And as the Allies were fighting in Normandy and up through France and into Belgium, the number of deaths of Allied soldiers decreased. Still horrible, still all these young men giving their lives to free Europe. But the number remained the same high number remained for at least a month, if not 2 months in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And again, here are some photos of the arrival of the Hungarian Jews. The railway ramp was extended deep into Birkenau to make it really close to the gas chambers. And you see the lineup on the ramp, and you can see the Nazi officers, and it looks pretty organized down here, the women on one side, the men on the other. But if you probably took a magnifying glass and zoomed in, you'd see a lot of people interacting. You see a woman maybe turning to a child, and just people talking to each other, and people have no idea where they are. Like, where are we? And what is this place? And it was just inconceivable. So now we're going to jump on the timeline and get really close to Bergen-Belsen. And what you see here, I just lifted a few things from Glen Hughes's archives. He had like boxes and boxes of things to sort through. And it was a challenge as a biographer to figure out what would be of interest to the reader and what do I not include, because he was a high up military man, and there was a lot of paperwork exchanged and a lot of documents marked top secret that are now available. But here's some charts that he had, or some outlines, and I just wanted to show you. So from his files, he had this is D-Day, D+1, D+2. It's 1 day after D-Day, 2 days, 3 days. And here he is. Just these are the kinds of things that were occupying him, which is, there is how many Neptune battle casualties, how many on the different beaches, the sum total of persons ashore, less the casualties, a column of how many were drowned and how many battle casualties, how many were wounded, and what percentage of the casualties they were, and how many were sick, and then the total sick and wounded. So these were the kinds of things that were occupying him, and bringing in special units, mobile neurosurgical units, maxillofacial units, and everything was planned. Like every surgery was planned, how long everything would take was planned down to practically the second. And the general hospitals that he had to commandeer, and how many beds there were in each one. And just another picture from his albums, just some images of the fighting. And here, just after they cross the Rhine, the Germans are surrendering to the British. This guy's carrying a white flag. They're throwing away their weapons and materials. And what it's like as they're going into places, liberating towns, and the cheering. And this is British humor. This is from the First and Second World War. If you want to see Blighty, which is Britain again, camouflage your vehicles, and then between these points your enemy lies, and he, like you, can use his eyes. So show no light and he won't get wise. This is the swastika. So just a little hint of some of the things he was encountering. And then April 15th. So here you have a man who had seen all the horrors of war. He testified at the Belsen trial, and he said, I have seen all the horrors of war, but nothing to touch it. And he came into Bergen-Belsen, and he was totally unprepared, totally shocked, in tears. This hardened medical officer didn't even know how he would go about cleaning up this place. So the April 15th was 3 weeks before the end of World War II. It's an amazing story how it was handed over to the Allies on Himmler's order, right? Himmler's order the summer before that no one was going to be turned over to the Allies alive. Himmler's order in Auschwitz saying in 1942 and 1943, the gas chambers and ovens were not efficient enough. They had to be improved. Himmler, who was bragging to Hitler, who really wanted to impress Hitler in 1941 when the Einsatzgruppen were following the Wehrmacht into the Ukraine and Russia about the Jews being killed and the families being wiped out. The same Himmler was convinced that he should hand over Bergen-Belsen to the Allies. So it's truth is stranger than fiction story how it happened, but it happened, and it enabled my mom's survival and the survival of some others. Of course, the race against time was lost for too many thousands. But as part of the truce, they had there had to be danger typhus signs erected everywhere. And here is the British Jeeps going in, and here is an image of the Bergen-Belsen camp. And I'm just going to tell you one story, which is that this is they had a road bisecting the camp. There were, I think it was 3 compounds on the left and 2 on the right, huge compounds separating men and women. And on April 12th, the day that the truce was signed between the British and the German army, the SS desperately tried to clean up the camp. And what they did was they had inmates who could still walk, who had still a little bit of life left in them, drag the corpses to a mass grave at the end of the road here. And I can remember that I must have been around the age my mom was. I must have been around 14 or 15 years old when I used to talk to her when she was in the laundry room in our basement. And I remember one night we were talking, and she was just telling me about Auschwitz. And then she was telling me about Bergen-Belsen, and she put down the iron. I used to watch her when she was ironing. And she put down the iron and stepped away from the ironing board and leaned forward and stretched her arms out behind her and demonstrated for me how she, who was 50% dead, dragged corpses, and some people who were just 90% dead, to a mass grave. And some people, that was lodged in my memory, because that's not something you typically hear when you're in high school. It's not a story parents usually don't have that kind of experience and that can share that kind of thing. But of course, she would say to me, I hope you don't have nightmares. But she would tell me about it. And this was before we even knew the word Holocaust. This was just what happened to her during the war. She hadn't talked to anyone else about it. But what happened in Bergen-Belsen is they quickly, after a couple of days, had to abandon this cleanup effort because too many of the slave laborers were dying on the job. So I tremble now showing you some of these images, but I think that they teach something, though none of us can imagine what it was really like. I have not come across a survivor testimony or a liberator testimony that said that you can imagine it, that Glen Hughes would say you had to have been there. My mother would say you had to have been there because no one could imagine the smell or anything. So here you see British officers, and they are pressing the remaining SS into service to help clean up the corpses. And in the background, you can see some of the survivors looking on, and some of them are jeering at the SS. And here you see one of the mass graves, and they were dug out. They were about 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet across, and 30 to 50 feet long, 40 to 50 feet long. And there were 13 of these mass graves, and they were if you go there now to Bergen-Belsen, you would see beautiful monuments there. 2,000 buried here, 3,000 buried here, 5,000 here, 10,000 here. And honestly, it was basically guesswork. They didn't know exactly. But here's Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who was the British military chaplain who came in with the liberators, who's just bereft at how people are being buried. And Anne Frank, she has a beautiful monument, her and Margot at Bergen-Belsen. It's not where they're buried. They're buried in one of these mass graves, as is my mother's cousin, Rachel Hecht, and everyone, other people. So it was just really a tragedy for how people had to be buried, but there were reasons for it. And Glen Hughes had given that order, and he was tortured by it. And here is a girl, and I show this picture because she has a square cut out of the back of her coat. And the people who were taken to slave labor camps, very often they got the clothing, the coats from Auschwitz, right, taken away from people deported there. And they had these large squares cut out the back. Why? Because lest they should try to escape on a death march or anything, they should be easily identifiable as Häftling, as prisoners. So here's some more images from the camp, and you could see these women survivors. They found some potatoes, which was a whole story, and how they tried to cook them, and they are completely inured to the backdrop. And my mom also has a story with her sister of that experience. And this became very important to me, these pictures. By the way, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen was the most photographed and documented liberation there was. So a lot of times when you see images from the Holocaust, it might say it's from Auschwitz or other places. A lot of the times it's from Bergen-Belsen, because the British film and photographic unit was called in to take these photographs and to take film footage, and they realized the historical significance and were afraid that people might deny that this happened, so they really tried to document it. So this is significant because the third day after the liberation, the 11th Light Field Ambulance came in and pitched a dump of tentage to get the very sick people away from the people who were dying in the huts, so that they could maybe get a sip of water to people in the huts to relieve the overcrowding. The dead and the living were all laying here in their own excrement, and they tried to clean up a little bit or make some order out of the chaos here. And my mom had an experience of having to go back and forth, and she had to actually crawl back from a tent back into the hut. And I wanted to see how far that was. Now, the liberation was complicated, right? It wasn't like, the Allied forces came in and everyone was cheering and happy and the sky is blue and the sun came out. It wasn't that way. It was a process. And there are a lot of things that you don't even think about. And in Bergen-Belsen, the SS did a lot of things to sabotage the situation before they left. So one thing the British Royal Engineers had to do as soon as they came in was to try to pump water into the camp, because the water supply had been sabotaged. And just here are some images of the mayors being from the surrounding area, the burgermeisters being brought in to see what their country had perpetrated, and some locals coming also to see. So the rescue. So this was quite complicated, and they had, and ultimately Glen Hughes brought in a team of people, and he tried to get people from wherever he could, from British medical schools and lots of different sources, the Red Cross and Belgian doctors from Belgium. And anyway, so it was a long process and a long time before people could come, and it took a long time to get things organized. But about a week after the liberation, they put into motion this sort of triage where they would go into the huts and mark those inmates who they thought had a chance of surviving. Just like a medic on a split second would just, try to discern, did somebody have a chance of life? Were they breathing? What kind of shape were they in? And then they these men went in with these hazmat type suits to protect them. Everything, typhus was everywhere. So everyone who went into the camp had to be sprayed with DDT and protected. And they brought them in these, what they called contaminated ambulances to this cavalry stables about 1.5 miles from the camp, where they set up about 60 tables, and just factory style they pressed German local nurses into service, because who else, they couldn't get enough people on hand. There was not enough person power, and they had to wash and clean and spray the really skeletal inmates with DDT. And then they were placed in a clean blanket. And it just, if you can imagine the logistics of trying to get like 14,000 blankets, and then taking them to this makeshift hospital area. It took a number of days to set this whole thing up. And you can also imagine how some of the inmates felt being handled by Germans. That was a whole other complication. And my mom has her own story of one of her greatest heartbreaks happened in the human laundry. So here is some approximate numbers. I'm going to read a little bit from the bottom. There were 14,000 patients in the Glen Hughes Hospital. Now, think about it. The survivors named the hospital for Glen Hughes. So this is a big hint. This was a big hint for me about how much they loved him and appreciated him and discerned his warmth and his moral motivation to try and save lives. And it was the largest such facility in Europe, the largest hospital. On May 19th, a little after a month after the liberation in 1945. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried in Bergen-Belsen. 17,000 people died there in the month of March alone. 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. So hard to imagine and fathom. You survived all that, and the liberators are there, and then people are still dying of typhus, of tuberculosis. There was at least 3 epidemics raging in the camp, also gastroenteritis. And my mom was one of those who was borderline very sick. And 750 to 1,000 sick were processed each day for over 3 weeks after liberation at the human laundry, the place for washing and disinfecting survivors. There was about 25,000 who were fit. And the way they could tell if you were fit was if you could walk up into a truck like 3 steps. If you could walk up 3 steps, you were fit, you were considered fit, and you were transferred to a formerly Wehrmacht transit and rehabilitation barracks. And this was where the start of the displaced persons camp were. So when the rescue effort was, the main part of it was deemed over on May 21st, the last hut was evacuated. It was burned down in this ceremony. And here's Glen Hughes. He gave the order for the last hut to be burned down, and he would not allow the British flag, the Union Jack, to be hoisted on May 8th, which was when the war victory in Europe, what day it was, but only on May 21st at the end. And here's a sign to the hospital, and here's the main hospital complex. So the burning down of the last hut at Bergen-Belsen was significant, and it was noted. And here, this little country off of the coast of Sri Lanka, the Maldives, issued these stamps for the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And one of them is of that moment. So here's the photograph, and here's the postage stamp. There you can see there are some former inmates, some now called displaced persons at the ceremony, and British soldiers watching as the effigy of Hitler and the Iron Cross burns down with the hut. So what happened after? So that's a big story. What happened after? I did a little bit of a survey just to sort of see what happened with my mom. There was about 174 survivors from Siget who wound up in Bergen-Belsen, who were taken to Sweden. The Swedish government, in a humanitarian gesture, took in about 7,000 of the sickest survivors. There were people who survived from Siget. Like there were about 13,000 people deported from Siget, maybe there were 2,000 who survived the war. They might have survived in different places. There might have been some who survived in Bergen-Belsen but didn't go to Sweden. So this isn't an exact, precise chart, but it does give an indication of who had the best chance of surviving the war. And you can see that people in their 50s and 40s had very little chance. And then you see some in their 30s and most in their 20s. And my mom was born in 1929. So there's only seven 15-year-olds at the end of the war, and very few who are younger than her. And her sister was born in 1928. And I had some aunts who also survived, who were they were in their 20s. So jumping ahead just a little bit about my mom's experience. She was taken to Sweden, put in quarantine, and the first place that she got any kind of individualized medical attention was at this makeshift hospital in Katrineholm, Sweden. And here she is. This is the very first picture we have of her. This is the earliest picture I have of her, and you can see that she still has black and blue marks under her eyes. She had been beaten up very severely, which is why she fell unconscious after the liberation. And here is Dr. Leffler, who really nursed her through the night and saved her life one night when she was burning hot with fever. And these are all young teenage survivors who were taken to this place. And the Swedish government had in mind that they would take these survivors in who had TB, who had typhus, and they would give them good nutrition, give them some medical care, and in 6 months they would be repatriated. Like, that was the main thing. People thought that after you liberate the concentration camps, people will be repatriated. Well, that was obviously crazy mistake, especially in Bergen-Belsen. I mean, maybe if people had come from France or Holland or the Western European countries, they could go back, but Eastern European people from Poland and Hungary and Romania, there was no home to go back to, or Lithuania. So most of them could not be repatriated. Their whole communities were destroyed. Anyway, so the Swedish government thought, okay, we'll take them in for 6 months. They'll go on their way, but that's not how things happened either. And my mom wound up living in Sweden for 10 years in and out of TB sanatoriums. So now I'm going to, does anyone have any questions? Should I continue with the next chapter, or, would you like to pause?
I think it's great if you continue for now. But anybody out there can put questions in the Q&A, and we'll have time to ask them at the end.
Okay. So now I'm going to take you into a chapter that my mom only witnessed a little bit of before she was taken to Sweden. But Glen Hughes saw quite a bit of, and it was a watershed for him. There was the experience of liberating the camp, and then there was the experience of going to the camp after his tour of duty was over and witnessing what was happening at what was set up to be a displaced persons camp on the premises of Bergen-Belsen, or Bergen-Belsen, the second part, the other Bergen-Belsen 2, where the hospital area was, where the transit and rehabilitation barracks were. So it is an extraordinary chapter in human history, really. So while mourning incalculable losses, survivors, nearly all of whom had lost most of their relatives, formed a vibrant displaced persons community. The devout and the secular, those who had lost faith, and those who held fast to Jewish precepts, united around a common goal: to create a meaningful narrative of their sufferings by turning their sights to a Jewish homeland and to a future in which they could live normal lives. And one extraordinary thing that happened at this displaced persons camp were marriages, weddings. Glen Hughes went to some of them. He was invited to the first wedding. And people, they didn't always know the fate of their spouse, but they pretty much knew that they lost everyone. And some people lost children and spouses, but the vast majority of survivors were in their 20s and 30s. And what they looked to do so quickly was to rebuild. And it was really quite something, because in the years after the war, before they even knew like where they were going to go, where country could they go to, and most of them had their sights set on a Jewish homeland in Palestine, because they really felt the need for a Jewish homeland after what had just happened to the Jewish people. So they paired up, a lot of them paired up while they were waiting and started to have children. So there had to be a special Bergen-Belsen ketubah written by the rabbis there. 420 men and 300 women who had been married and did not know the fates of their spouses were granted permission to remarry, with a caveat here that they had to somehow have some provision for a spouse if they happened to show up. And here are images from what started to happen within a couple of years, 2-3 years after the liberation, in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp, which was the largest baby boom in human history. The Fräulein, the women, the German women in the countryside, were not having children very much, but the people in the DP camp were having babies. Just everybody was like, people were getting married and having babies. So here you see a parade of baby carriages of women in the DP camp, and everybody, they had to have a gone and play for the children. And it was quite an extraordinary thing. About 2,000 babies were born in the Glen Hughes Hospital. Today, they're all in their 70s, mid to late 70s. And really all throughout the war, but and this is just a case of immediately after, a great creativity and resourcefulness was displayed among the inmates. So here you have this woman. She really wanted to get married in a white wedding dress. So her husband worked and her fiance worked where there was provisions, and he traded like 2 sacks of coffee beans and 2 packs of cigarettes to a German officer who gave him his parachute. And they took it to a seamstress in Bergen-Belsen, and she fashioned this wedding dress with a big bow and back. So this woman got her dream of getting married in a white gown. And this woman, she wound up marrying a British soldier. I think his name was Turgal, and he got hands on a British parachute made of heavy silk, and this gorgeous gown was fashioned from that. And this woman who survived, this girl, she was about 18 or 19 at the end of the war, and she found 2 like sticks, like wooden sticks, and she found some German soldiers' socks that she unraveled the wool, and she knit herself this sweater. So there was these amazing stories, creativity. There was a Jewish theater, concentration camp theater, where people reenacted scenes that they had recently experienced, and terrible scenes of children being taken away from their parents from the ghetto, and it was very cathartic for the audience to see these performances in the camp. And the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training, or it came to the camp, and they tried to give people certain skills and training, whether to be seamstresses or welders. Here this is a dental technician class, and here are people working on dental technician type things, and they tried to equip people, and people tried to prepare for their future. And the DP camp even had a police force, right? At one point there was as many as 12,000 people who not only survived from Bergen-Belsen, but who came from other places in Europe. They wound up coming to the Belsen camp. And here's the police force parading through the camp, the DP camp. And this is a birth certificate of a baby who was born in the Glen Hughes Hospital. And this was an artist who was in the Glen Hughes Hospital, and he made a series of 11 drawings. And this one says, "What now? We survived, what now?" And this is a magazine that was printed, and the green ink was a real novelty. It was printed in the nearby town of Celle, and it was called Our Voice, and it was put out by the DP community. And there's a Bergen-Belsen organization in Israel that puts out a beautiful magazine following in the same tradition called Our Voice. You can go online and see their magazines. So uniting around a common goal. So this was quite politically like a bomb, but because the British did not want to let the survivors go to Palestine. It was they had their own interests in the Middle East, but the Jews really were advocating to go to Israel. And here's Yossel Rosensaft, who emerged as a leader among the survivors. He was a diminutive, tiny man, but he was a powerhouse. And Glen Hughes and him developed a lifelong friendship. Glen Hughes was so impressed with the way he organized things. And the people who were really the organizers, who emerged, who survived the war and tried to organize people, or a lot of them had been active in Jewish youth groups before the war, Zionist youth groups, different ones. And they had the skills and talents to organize. And here's a visit from the Jewish Brigade in Palestine. And it was quite something for these survivors to see Jewish men in uniform. Here is an image of, they called themselves a kibbutz. They were organizing to become part of a kibbutz, and they had a sports team and everything. They had these groups there. And here's a rally of survivors advocating to go to Palestine. So now I'm going to play for you a brief video. This is Rabbi Tzvi Asaria Herman Helfgott, who was from Yugoslavia. He was a rabbi and a POW, Yugoslavian POW during the war. And as soon as the war was over, he heard about Bergen-Belsen and went to help out.
ולקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה פקודה מאנגלים שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים כן. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשחיילים בדרך כלל, האנגלים, נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן לקבור אותה. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולל, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי. והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיים. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, כן, בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו לאשכול לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלזן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו' וכו' וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם חופה וקידושים שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף כשאני החזקתי לידיו. הילד האלף.
So I love listening to Sorry, Health Guide. There's more videos of him talking about his experience at Bergen-Belsen if you go on YouTube. Anyway, so then my story ends with the epilogue. And so here's Glen Hughes at the time of the liberation, and you can sort of see the seriousness in his eyes. And here he is after the war. He was a big sportsman. He was a father figure of rugby football. Someone could write a whole book about him in sport, golf, and rugby. But he did some really significant things after the war that I think impact all of us in our lives today. It may have an effect on you. It may have an effect on one of your loved ones in terms of how people die and his research. And I connect it to his experience and that he wasn't able to save so many thousands of lives. This is a picture of my mom and her sister. They're young ladies in Sweden. This is my dad. He's in a DP camp. This is a picture of him in a DP camp in Germany. And this is their wedding picture. And this is a picture of my mom recently. And she speaks to school groups everywhere. And that's really it. This is a sign that was erected in Bergen-Belsen at the time of the liberation. It's not there anymore. It probably deteriorated. Right now, if you go to Bergen-Belsen, they do have a really good exhibit there. But this is an example of British sort of sarcasm. 10,000 unburied dead were found here. Another 13,000 have since died, all of them victims of the German New Order in Europe, and an example of Nazi culture, because of course the Nazis were known to have such high culture and so civilized. And this is my website. If anyone has any questions anytime, and if something occurs to you later on, you can always email me or get in touch with me through my website. And now I'll stop the share. And I hope, can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Okay,
you.
I can't
Perfect,
hear
no.
you at all. For some reason on my computer, you are muted.
Okay.
I don't know if you can do something or I can take questions.
Art, are you able to hear me?
Art, I don't know why I
me?
can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No.
I can hear Art, but
Oh, now I can hear you.
oh, you can hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you for such a moving and engaging lecture. The pictures are so powerful and the story is so powerful. So I appreciate that. And Everyone who's out there now can feel free to send us some questions. We're compiling them here to be able to ask. So first, I would like to ask maybe just there's a few specific questions that that some of our participants have asked, and so I'll start with those. One was, what was the pamphlet, or why was the pamphlet for the concentration camp theater in English? Was that, I misread it.
That's a very good catch. I think I don't know if was it in English? I don't know if it was.
I think the question, I misread the question. I think it was why, or what did it mean in English? I think is what. Oh, there's sorry, my coworker here is saying the title was in English.
Title was in English. I don't know. That's a good question. I have to sort of go back and see.
Okay, no worries. Where was the hospital located?
Yes, that's right, concentration camp theater, and on the bottom it says Cazette Theater. I don't know if it's because the British were also coming, the British liberators were also coming, but it's a really good question. I hadn't picked up on that.
Thank you. Where was the hospital located?
It was about 2 miles from the Bergen-Belsen camp.
Okay. And somebody asked, are the pictures that you showed, are they also featured in your book, or are they available somewhere for people to?
No, so I
view?
tried not to. Very few of the pictures that you saw today are in my book. I have different ones in my book, but if anyone's interested in a particular picture, I could always email it to them. But most of them can be found online, and there is the Auschwitz album where you can find things online. And then if you go to Google Images, you'll see images that were taken by the British Army's Film and Photographic Unit.
Thank you. And for the ketubah, I believe that you mentioned there was a provision. Was the provision that if the spouse came back, that the marriage be void? Do you know more details on that?
No, I don't know the details, but I think it was very sensitively worded. I don't think that the rabbis expected people to get divorced and void these marriages that they had just built anew. But if somebody did show up from a previous life, which happened, right? It's just was crazy making after the war, then they would have to have some sort of provisions for them, whether it was some kind of material or financial, but not to disregard that person completely.
Great, thank you. There are a number of different questions here asking about how the story of your family continued, how your parents met, and what brought them to the U.S. If you want to say more about their story.
Yeah. So I mentioned that I have aunts who survived. My father's 2 sisters survived Bergen-Belsen, and they were with my mom throughout the war, my mom and her sister. And I actually have another aunt who also survived, who married my uncle. So they met in the United States after the war, 10 years after the war. My aunts met each other, and it was sort of a matchmake. Like, you have a single brother, you have a sister who's in Sweden, and she's all alone. And my father was already in this country, and my father went over to Sweden to meet my mother, and they married. I don't know if you ever saw there's this like crazy TV show called 90 Day Fiance. It always reminds me of that, because it's like this reality TV thing where they're writing to somebody from another country, and they go meet them and they get married. Well, it wasn't exactly that way, because my parents had such similar backgrounds to each other. And my father really understood, because they were both survivors from the Hungarian provinces. My father really, and his sisters survived the same ordeal as my mother. He really understood more about where she had been. And her father had been in Hungarian forced labor, which is where my father was during the war. So, and they came from similar socioeconomic backgrounds in Europe, which means they were very poor. Like, it was a very poor area of the world. So they had a lot of the same values. And my mom had lived in Sweden for 10 years, right? She was dating mostly Swedes. So her story could have easily wound up being very different, but it was very good that they found each other. So
Yeah, that's wonderful that they found each other. Um, what a number of questions also. So, survivors had a very, obviously a very difficult time, and they were able to build new lives. Do you have any thoughts on how they were able to, or their ability to do that, to move on and to build new lives?
so there's as many different types of survivors as there are types of people, right? But in my parents' case, because they came from a background where they really had to scramble as children, and they both had to help a lot support their families, they really expected nothing and appreciated everything. So it was really through their own hard work, and through their own hard work and determination, they rebuilt their lives. My mom was so young, right? She wasn't thinking, like I showed you all those pictures from the Belsen DP camp. She was 15. She wasn't about to get married and have so she needed those 10 years in Sweden to recuperate, to have her nightmares, to come to her own before she came to this country. And my father was really unusual for because he was like 25 when he was in DP camp. He was like young man. He was 25, 26, 27. And a lot of people were coupling, right? They were married, they were getting together. And he was in a different DP camp in the American zone. And a lot of people were getting married and having babies. And he just thought to himself that his future was so uncertain. He was just a really serious person and wanted to be more established before he got married and had a family. So he didn't know my mother, but he kind of waited for her to grow up, and that's how it happened. And when they said about building their life together in the United States, they just worked super, super hard. My father was really a hard worker, and taking any kind of charity was sort of anathema to him. I mean, that's who he was. And so he didn't really take advantage of the organizations that were helping survivors like HIAS. He just went to work right away and very quickly established himself. He was a kosher butcher. So within 1 year of this country, without even really knowing the language, he bought his own butcher shop and just worked really hard for his whole life. So that's how they.
Yeah, it sounds and it sounds like an amazing story, and I appreciate you sharing that, the family aspect of it. This question here is rather specific. There's a number of joining us this evening. There's a number of people who relate to your story in many different ways. One person noted that they were born in Bergen-Belsen in April 1947, and the birth certificate says Hone, which he spelled Hohne, which is the sister town to Belsen. So he was wondering, or I'm not sure who the person is. So, was the Hughes Hospital, was this the Hughes Hospital that you were referring to?
Yeah, and it changed its name to Hone.
Okay, great, thank you. Many other comments appreciating your story and what you had to tell. A more specific question: how long was the DP camp in operation?
About 5 years after the war. I think it was dismantled, and like the last people left in like 1950.
There's a few questions. If you have any thoughts about, or if you want to share anything about your experiences growing up, being the child of a Holocaust survivor, and sort of what that experience was like. There's also someone who noted that it's rare in their experience for parents of survivors to tell so many stories, and so it's wonderful that you know so many stories of your family. And so I don't know if there's a way you want to discuss those.
Yeah, so my mom was basically very shy for most of her life. She was a really shy person, but there was some kind of just our personalities, there was some kind of chemistry between us or something, because I I was always curious and I would ask a lot of questions. And what she did, which didn't happen in a lot of survivor homes. I mean, it's a very delicate thing, right? The child doesn't want to ask, they don't want to bring their parents back to a really painful place. And the parent doesn't necessarily want to tell the child because they don't want the child to hear such horrors. And I know that either side can shut down a conversation pretty quickly. But our personalities were such that she never made me feel bad about asking or afraid to ask. So that it starts with that. It starts with that real openness and that real willingness to go with, let the child take the conversation wherever it's going to go and answer honestly with, whatever anecdotes you can share. And it starts with that basic thing. So she never made me afraid to ask. And I was also a little bit with my father, I could maybe bring him to tears sometimes more easily. He's a more sensitive type. My mother was sensitive, but there was something about her that was also maybe a little hardened, something. And but she was smart about it. It wasn't like she had a background in psychology. She just had common sense. So like when I was a little kid and didn't want to go to bed and I was 6 or 7 years old and I'd go down, climb out of bed and go down to the kitchen. And as long as I could keep her talking, I could stay up. And so I would ask her questions and she would tell me about her childhood in Siget. It was so interesting to me. Like it was so different from how I grew up. Like there were children who were making games out of walnut shells. Like she was poor and it was kind of interesting. And then she had this whole post-war life in Sweden and where she had dates and she had a lot of anecdotes and stories and people she met that became part of her life. She had been a nanny and she did all these different things. What wasn't driven home to me until I really started writing the book was how hard she had it, how much responsibility she had as a little kid, and even though her parents tried to protect her and she had a very happy, loving home, and then but how hard it was when the war came, starting in her family in 1940, and then how hard the years were after the war in Sweden. Being orphaned, being sick, feeling like a nobody, and how she tried to get an education and had so many setbacks. So I really began to appreciate as I was writing it, just what it must have been like, right? Removing myself a little bit. But she always told me things at sort of an age appropriate stage. Like, I heard a webinar today, a podcast about somebody asking, should you teach kids in middle school about the Holocaust? And it's really, she didn't. I mean, she really waited until I was ready to receive the information and followed my line of questioning. So that was how it sort of unfolded. I never sat down to interview her. And when I was writing the book, I might have called her or sent her an email, like we were in communication every day. And I was very lucky to have her, because I might have sent her an email saying something like, I hate to take you back to this moment in time, but can you possibly search your memory and tell me what were you wearing on the death march? And so this way I would have the answer and stuff surrounding it sometimes. And I was able to get certain details in writing the book that I have no imagination, right? It's not a work of fiction. Everything in it is true. So it's directly from her.
Thank you. And sort of like continuing the narrative or reflections on your mother's experiences, how does she feel about her place of birth today and the people and sort of the culture of that? You had mentioned that she didn't want to, you were concerned about her going back to the land. So
yeah, well, I had sent her some pictures of buildings that were beautiful that were now dilapidated, like this very rich family. The Khans had a beautiful, like, palatial home, and now dogs were living in it, so she didn't like to see that, so I thought, oh, it's better her memories are her memories. But I don't think she harbors any prejudice or bad feeling toward anyone. I mean, yes, like it's complicated. It's really complicated because while she was in the ghetto in Siget, her non-Jewish neighbors were very helpful to her family. So it's complicated. And during the war, like, so, you know, I'll just give you a couple of illustrations. So once I asked her, I must have been really young, and I said, what would you do if you caught a Nazi? Like, what would the punishment be? Like, what would you do? So I remember she told me she was very specific. She said, I would put him in the bathtub and I would put him under the faucet and I would do a slow water drip, like Chinese water torture. Like she had a real, like she just, of course, I mean, she just hated the Nazi, you know, the SS. And then I asked her later, I said, there was a woman in one of the labor camps where she was, Christianstadt, and who she worked for. She actually worked in this woman's villa. And I said, what would you do if you met Lucy? Like if you met this SS officer, Lucy? She said, oh, I would give her a hug and a kiss. So like, it's really complicated, right? So when you, so she wouldn't forgive the Nazis. I mean, her entire family was practically wiped out except for her and her sister. But on a person-to-person level, when she had this encounter with someone who was praising her and making, you know, giving her a certain opportunity, she felt differently. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience does. Sort of as a second to last question, there's some participants who are interested in maybe doing research into their own family's history, and I don't know if you have any advice for them on some places to look first.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I just want to tell them, tell those people that search your memory for little hints that were dropped, little things that might have just been, because even if your parents didn't share a lot, first even if they didn't give their testimony, they might have said little things over the kitchen table. And those could be windows into a bigger story, a bigger context. So if you have something, like I'm trying now with my father, who I didn't hear nearly as much from as my mother, but like, there's a story there. There's a story, like he, you know, once over dinner, he mentioned that he was on the ship, the Omar Bundy. Like who knew? Who knew? And now I'm discovering it was like the second ship to come to the United States on the Truman Refugee Act in 1948. Like there's a story there. So I would say, pay attention, like search your memory for little things. And if you have any sort of documents or papers or pictures or photos, things can be a window into a bigger story. And there are wonderful resources now. The Steven Spielberg archives there have cataloged them, and if you know where your parent is from, whether or not they've given a testimony, you can type in that town or that place and hear other people describing it or what they went through during the war, and you can get some kind of triangulated picture of what things might have been like. So look for clues that you can follow like a detective.
Great, thank you. And as a final question, as we're now at 9 o'clock, do you have any final thoughts in a more broad sense about the Holocaust learning and where people could go for other resources, or just the state of education in our world today? If any thoughts for us?
Well, we thankfully have so many resources. I'm personally, I mean, there's so many great books that have been written. There's scholarly books and there's memoirs and stories. I really lean toward nonfiction. If you are interested in Auschwitz, I could send some resources to you actually, if you want. I can send, you know, I like to read everything that was written by or about the Sonderkommando, who are really very close to the death, to the killing. There's several good books about Bergen-Belsen. If you want, Matthew, I can send you some that you can send to people if you want.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Our participants would definitely appreciate some resources, and anything that can help them learn further
Yeah,
about this time period. And it's, as I said at the beginning, these stories are so important to tell and to hear. And so thank you again for sharing your story and your family story and your research. And I hopefully those of you out there who are interested can pick up the book. We can provide some information in our follow-up emails about the book also. So thank you. And thank you again for sharing it. And
thank
it's
you
very
so
moving.
much. Thank you all for choosing to attend this evening. Thank you.
Yeah.